Pleasure to be here. I feel like I'm the only person who isn't speaking at more than one conference today.
You'll get there. You'll get there.
Incredible. Yeah. You're raising a very high standard for me. So thank you for inviting me into your space. Very much appreciate that. I'm excited to be here, excited to share and learn as well. And I feel like I'm bridging that gap because for me here, it's in the evening. I know for some of you, it's very early. So there's temporal diversity as well as other things that we'll be discussing. So yeah, very happy to be here. Thank you.
Excellent. And Lucen, we've had you before. It's so great to see you again. You want to do a quick intro? You've given talks at DevRelCon in the past on, the importance of thinking about diversity inclusion during interviews. What's going on with you now?
Hi, thanks for inviting me to join. I'm just like super excited to hear what happens and learn from y'all. I had been working at Carrot, which was a company that specializes in technical interviewing, and just in my work as a manager, I was just very deeply involved in community building, onboarding, hiring practices, recruiting, and trying to make that more inclusive and accessible. I've currently sort of switched through pivoted my DevRel community skills towards podcasting. And so I'm currently organizing the San Francisco Podcaster Playground. So
very cool.
Career pivots, I guess.
Yes.
It's still community work.
Absolutely, yes. So I just created, I'm going to show here, not the slide view. We'll talk about Jonathan's site. I just grabbed a screen grab of that. Of course, we're going to be talking about sort of the assumption that community health requires inclusion and safety. And then I just created these slides as reference points, as our talking points. Jonathan has a great thing about the 3 Ps. And then we had a great email thread about what community means. And I was sort of breaking down sort of the 3 categories that Jonathan brings out, and maybe there are areas to discuss. And Jonathan, obviously, or not obviously, but if you listen to the podcast series, you'll see that employee resource groups are quite a core part of that discussion. So if I could do this full screen, if this works. So this is a screen grab. Jonathan, you want to tell us a little bit about element of inclusion?
Yes, so my full name is Dr. Jonathan Ashong Lamptey. This is why you can see I call myself Dr. Jonathan. It's much easier for everyone. I'm the founder of the Element of Inclusion. And we're a consultancy. We work with organizations to make them inclusive. Typically, that means research, training, consulting, thought leadership in the terms of the podcast. Today was episode 223. We're in our 5th year of informing and educating using applied research and thought leadership. I take a lot of research from my PhD and apply it here, from working with clients and applying it here. So it's not just academic, highbrow information and insights. I use a lot of practical, pragmatic tips, and that's what I really want to share with you today. And Lucien, you're talking about podcasts. We have to have a catch up about podcasts. I'm the biggest fan. Most of my episodes are quite short though, 10 to 15 minutes. So something that you can sort of dip into and get through quite quickly.
That's perfect.
Awesome. I will now close this so you can see, like I said, it won't be elegant, but I'll just move to this if they are useful for reference. So yes, the starting point, and if I'll be monitoring the Discord if people disagree, but we wanted to sort of say, not to speak for the whole, but if it is a starting point that if you don't have inclusive and safe practices within your company, it's essentially going to be pretty impossible to make sure that you're extending that out into the community that you're supporting. And in our job, it's often technical communities or could be extended beyond that. So Jonathan, I'll be honest, like we talked so much in our email thread that do you have a particular starting point that you think would be helpful?
Let's do this, because diversity and inclusion are 2 of the most used and abused words in the workplace today. So let's get a shared point of reference, and we'll cycle back to this as well later, because it's a real good strategy that I use when I'm trying to engage and make safe spaces in terms of being able to connect with people meaningfully. So when I talk about diversity, I think of it as a management approach. So that recognizes that, number one, we have differences as individuals and that there is value in those differences. So I'm thinking about it as an approach. So that's a good starting point. Inclusion is a systematic business strategy to ensure that everyone shares the same advantages and benefits. So everyone can perform, everyone can belong, everyone can reach their potential. So when you're thinking of a community, I think it's useful to think about inclusion. How can we get everyone to perform? How can we get everybody to belong? And how can we get everybody to reach their potential? Now, you will have particular ideas about what reaching your potential means, what belonging means, and also what performance means. But that's a useful starting point. So for each of your communities, getting a clear idea about that is a good starting point in terms of moving forward.
That's great. And I kind of want to go also to, how we're not perfect. I'm sure we've all been brought up to have so many biases. So what would be some pragmatic ways in which we're thinking about the strategy for inclusion, but also being aware, okay, what blinders do I have on? Who am I still not including?
Yeah, I think a useful way to think about that, and this brings us back to those 3 Ps, is what's the actual problem we're trying to address? Because we're talking about biases, but the truth is we all have biases. And if we're focusing on the bias, that's important, it's relevant, but where are we on our journey, specifically in my community, in my team, with the tasks that I'm doing? So these 3 Ps are really useful. So it's people, potential, performance. People, organizations, communities struggle to engage the people that they want to include. You will often hear this characterized as being people who are underrepresented, people from marginalized groups, people who are from disadvantaged groups. That's typically the narrative you hear, but it also means people who aren't from disadvantaged groups, who aren't from marginalized groups. That's really important because inclusion means everyone. So we have to get people who are from the minority, so-called majority, and there's people who don't even acknowledge or accept those terms. So if we're talking about biases, it may be in the context of we're trying to address specific individuals. Potential is about creating a culture of inclusion where everybody can reach their potential. Once again, we need to be clear in our community what that means, but allowing everybody to perform, belong, reach their potential is at the heart and probably one of the biggest issues that we need to address. So going back to your point about bias, creating that culture, and these are the day-to-day norms, interactions that we have, that's really important. And then the last point, I really want to pick up on this point about performance. Excuse me, because people think when we're talking about performance, there's a very heavy emphasis on metrics. I know that, you know that. But when we're talking about performance, it's more about how does diversity and inclusion show up where you work. So if I was to say to you, everyone says that, oh, diversity, inclusion, it's really great. But if I was to say to you, in your community, how does it show up? How is it good for you? That's the real question that you need to address. So if we think about that as a framework, when we're talking about bias, is it about the performance part? Is it about the people? And for the most part, it's probably about the people. And so in particular, I've got a way that is really useful for you to think about how you engage with others. Because we all think, and this came up on the thread that we had, Tamara, about communication. We all think that when we're communicating with individuals, that the way we communicate is the right way. But suppose we were sending an email thread and I was communicating with you in capitals. That we know that capitals, well, many of us believe that when we're speaking in capitals, we're shouting, but that might not be obvious to everyone. Probably at this stage in your careers, that is obvious, but in my example, so you really want to explore the intention of the person you're communicating with. What is their intended outcome? What are they trying to achieve? That's really useful whenever you're speaking with anyone. What are they trying to achieve? What's their intention? And that often helps us to overcome some very basic communication biases that we have when we're not face-to-face with people.
Absolutely.
Does that make sense?
Absolutely. Yeah. And we were just in the thread, right? I like how you call out, we assume we're communicating in the right way. And that would bring up one. Yesterday, we had a great session on, how we're all, in most of what we do, we're teachers. And if you have any kind of educational background, you know that there are people who learn in different ways, the textual learners, visual learners, kinetic learners, oral learners. And so, I shared in a workshop, it's human. It's totally fine to feel like, I've explained this a million times. Why doesn't this person get it? Think about how maybe they need to hear it in a different way or through a different medium, right? Or it's in the docs. Why don't they just read the docs? Well, maybe they did read the docs, but they need a video, or they need some kind of hands-on way. So I think that's a good reminder. Secondly, English, right? We are using English as a common language within our communities and at work for the most part that I've experienced. And I'd say the majority of people in our distributed teams, English is not a first language. So I think that comes back to also, like, I as a manager and as a community manager work hard to create a safe space so that when there is language-based friction, we have a sense of a trust that I can gently say, oh, hey, recently, we were talking about how some people would say, like, oh, that makes no sense to me, or that's nonsense. And like, when you gently go back and say, oh, actually in English, that's highly offensive, the other person actually doesn't know. And they're like, oh, so we can suggest, like, maybe say, oh, I'm confused by your comment. Can you tell me more? And then, that can avoid a lot of friction. So really good point.
Tamar, can we pick up on that point about safe spaces as well? Because I think this often gets misunderstood. So when I talk about safe spaces, it's really about psychological safety, which is crucial in a community for everybody to feel safe. So when we're talking about psychological safety, specifically, we are saying we don't want an environment where people will be humiliated, people will be ridiculed for either raising questions, making statements. So we want to create an environment. And let's be clear, sometimes I want to draw a difference between psychological safety and feeling uncomfortable. So we're not overtly trying to make anyone feel uncomfortable, but we are making sure that whenever we're communicating with anyone, any engagement that we have, if someone asks what you think is a stupid question or something that you would expect them to know, we want to create an environment where everybody feels comfortable enough to share. And also that means they may get feedback. Part of the process in a community, you're all focused on a particular technology, you're all developing and learning at different rates, but you're all contributing to this particular goal. It may mean that you need feedback, and being able to get that feedback in a way that is psychologically safe for the person receiving the feedback, as well as the person providing it, is really important. So I want to draw that distinction, because discomfort is often part of what we're doing when we're growing.
Can I ask you a question on this that I've seen people struggle with, especially with COVID bringing things online, is how do we scale psychological safety, or build that, especially, the internet is sort of an unsafe place in some ways, for people, or it's just intimidating. How do organizations scale that in an inclusive way,
Yes. So I think one of the ways is, like you said, social media in particular can be it doesn't feel safe, because you feel as if you're going to get trolled, or you ask a question, there are assumptions about what you're thinking and how you're thinking it. So I think you just need to have a very particular set of standards, really important standards that are crucial and one of them could be, we always speak with respect, right? We always assume that the intention behind anything that's being said is reasonable. And for the most part, it's very useful. Here's a phrase I always use. So what kind of? So if someone asks a question, you say, what kind of X? What kind of Y? And they will normally clarify that for you. That's a really important trick. And it's a hack that you can use all the time. If you think that is this person serious? What kind of whatever? And then they'll give you a response, and that will give you a better way of doing it. So I would say the more people use that, that would make it a lot more scalable.
Yeah.
I wanted to return to the 3 Ps, the people, potential, and performance. So for the performance part, Jonathan, you gave a great breakdown on how we're thinking through the biases. Because right now, especially in the public conversation, we think, oh, minorities or certain groups, but those are assumptions too, right? Like, and in our conversations we've had in our tech areas, I heard yet another sort of blanket statement, but someone I could understand, which was that it was a conversation in which it's so important, whether you're in the community or as managers, to have proactive appreciation. And then if it can be afforded, like, raises and promotions, in the sense that someone said, oh, that feels like engineering culture, in the sense that, you have a lot of people who don't want to have to argue for a raise. They're not comfortable with what feels like combative negotiations. And so I thought, within a community, right? That's why we talk about champions programs. Like, there are people doing all kinds of stuff, and it's really important for us as community managers to be proactively noticing and thanking. Rewarding is a kind of a side conversation where there might not be agreement, but the thanking just means so much, right? And then in the workplace, similarly, if you're in a company that maybe is a startup and can't afford to do raises at the moment, still having that feedback loop of appreciation and communication is really important, because at least in a company, I said, I don't want to work in a company where the only people who stick around or get raises are the ones who are comfortable to aggressively ask for that. And then the other people who aren't comfortable with that, regardless of, how they might be tagged or what they might look like on the outside. There are many, many people that I know haven't gotten well-deserved raises or promotions because it's just easier for them to avoid that. And so I was thinking, how do we take that back into actual pragmatic exercises, like I mentioned, champions program in the community, and hopefully proactive management. But are there other things that you've looked at to make sure that you have a diverse group and not just lose all the people where it's just easier for them to just look for another job than negotiate with their boss for something that they well deserve?
Sure. And I think there's probably a couple of points in there in terms of, because, you that phrase, what's it? The squeaky wheel gets the oil, right? Yeah. And so I suppose the real question is, who's being rewarded and why? And if we're talking about a raise, a pay raise, because if the people who complain are the only ones who get a raise, that's an approach that needs to be changed. We need to actually look at what is it we want, what are the characteristics, the behaviors and outcomes of the people who deserve a raise, and then we proactively look for those behaviors. So even if you're not raising your hand metaphorically or physically, then you will be identified. So that's one way. Actually need to address that process. Another thing is to actually reconsider the concept of rewards anyway. Because if you're particularly in a voluntary group, it's not always about the money or the rewards, status, recognition. You spoke about appreciation. These are really important points. What I find when I work with communities, specifically the ERGs, we define them as groups, voluntary groups with shared interests, shared values, or shared identity. So if we focus on shared interests and values, what we find is the people who leave, they tend to leave because, one, the actual goals, the purpose of the group isn't aligned with what they thought it was going to be. So they came in thinking it was one thing and they're not actually doing it or achieving it. And then the other thing is because of individuals within the community. And specifically, they may feel, and you also heard this, people don't leave the company, they leave their boss, right? So in a community, people would be leaving, not necessarily the community as a whole because they're no longer aligned with it, but maybe it's the people they're interacting with. Maybe those individuals aren't appreciating them, the way they speak to them. And there's two really interesting things to consider. So when people talk about fairness, like we're talking about inclusion, for the most part, we're always talking about fairness. Now, pretty ambiguous term. There's a form of fairness called interactional justice. Interactional justice related to fairness in organizations. And there's two things that come up that I think are really relevant for your communities. Number one is that it is informational justice. How is information being shared? So going back to your point about getting the raise, is it that only some people hear this information or only some people get that tap on the shoulder? If that's the case, we need to address that directly. And then the other thing is interpersonal justice. How am I treating you with respect? When you do a task or complete a task, am I ridiculing you? Am I being rude to you? These are things in a community that the people on the margins who are experiencing this and may not be comfortable talking about, they're the ones who are going to leave. And it's really difficult to engage with them once they've left.
Yeah, I was also looking at my notes from one of your podcasts. I liked how you were kind of defining also maybe a different way of how we see fairness, is that you said that we want this idea that people have the same advantages and benefits to reach their full potential. I really like that. Do you want to share a little bit more on that?
And when I say the same advantages and benefits, I don't mean identical. It just means that it's this idea almost of equality of opportunity. We've got the same shot, right? You've got the same shot. You've got the same chance to be hired, to get that raise, to get that opportunity. And so it's useful when we're thinking about inclusion. It's kind of like freedom. You know, you've got this idea of liberty and freedom to, liberty from. Yeah. It's really useful when we're thinking about inclusion. What are the processes, procedures, what's standing in the way of people actually moving forward? And what are the things that are in place that are holding people back? And so if it is the way we communicate, the times that we meet, the people who are favored, who we normally get into the community, these are things that we really need to think about. And so on a practical basis, I don't know, do you have a practical example of where someone isn't, or a common example of the way you think, actually, how can we address the advantages and benefits? Have you got an example that we could explore?
I don't know, Lucen, you turned on your mic. I have an example, but do you have a thought?
Go for it. There's so many examples. Go for it.
Yeah, give us one. I want to get more practical and more deep for the audience.
Yeah, I'm going to go more for, I don't know if the word is systemic, but if anybody has observed, you might, you've worked enough in an industry, you might notice that in some fields, you might see that the people who tend to get the VP jobs or are close to that, they might be a similar height or skin color or have a certain complexion. And when you notice that, you're like, and you talk amongst your friends in the industry, like, have you noticed that? They're like, oh yeah, isn't it funny that like so many of the people who have that same title across many companies have these very similar physical attributes. There's, we feel that seems indicative that there's some kind of belief that you have to look like that to be successful or to be seen as a leader. And then you also hear stories of people who don't look like that and, have struggled to get that promotion to be at the top. And so I joke that if I find out that like suddenly developer relations is just littered with people with my same kind of job title and they all kind of have my look and skin tone, then I'll wonder, did I get this job because of my qualifications, or did I get this job because somehow they just said that's what a head of developer experience looks like, right? So that's my example.
So that's a great point, which is there's an established archetype of success, right? That's what success looks like. And for us in our communities now, that may feel like something that's difficult to address, but what could we do where we are is look at the archetypes that exist for success in your communities, and how can you present new ones that are genuine success? So we're not talking about lowering standards or, moving the goalposts, as we say here, but how can we present success, but actually it looks different to what's already there? Because we want to create an environment where, as we said, everyone shares the same advantages and benefits. So everybody feels as if they could get there, but we need to present more than one path of getting there, one person who has achieved that. And so that's a really quick and easy thing that we can do in the communities. Over time, that will affect everything above. But as you said, you talked about systemic issues. I don't want to try and task everybody here with fixing that immediately.
Yeah. Yes. The typical...
Lucian, did you have an example?
Oh, yes. I just want to say the typical practitioner concept is like very, it's a problem with how with a lot of recruiting and hiring and even with performance management for raises. And so I think one simple thing is don't just have one. When you think of what it takes to be successful in a role, don't just have one. We know conceptually we want to build these heterogeneous teams. Like, I just know from experience as a manager, wow, my teams are better when people are filling in different ways that is stronger. So really like writing down and saying, actually, there's 3 ways someone could be successful a success looks like, and keep trying to sort of extend that. But yeah, typical practitioner. I mean, it's almost like this natural thing we do as humans to like, okay, what is a tree? You know, it is a thing that looks like this instead of the categorization
millions thing. Yeah, it could be. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. I have a thought here, which is also actually this might. Sorry, this is not another example. I'm trying to think. Okay, introductions are something. I just want to add this to the mix. I guess my post-COVID hobby has been extroversion, professionally and personally. And so I just notice the way I interact with a group, ERG or otherwise, is often almost like so dependent on how they handle introduction, like directly introduction, and just that the concept of how we meet each other and show up for these, identities and the things you have listed, and how people get reintroduced and how people are encouraged to step forward or step back. So I've been really intrigued by this lately, and trying to figure out the difference between, cultural policing or identity policing or gender policing, for example, which I encounter, or the policing that is negative, and the step forward, step back that is positive. Sorry, I could come up with a specific example here, but I just wanted to throw this into the mix because I'm interested if what you think about this.
So tell me more about the idea of policing in terms of, let's say, gender policing. Let's talk about that. What do you mean? So actually, remember what I was saying earlier? What kind of gender policing?
Great. Oh, we're doing the example live. So for example, I use they pronouns, and for some people that is not something that they want to do, or the concept of non-binary gender or changing gender. They have a different view of that than me. And so I've just seen that's an interesting thing that I think is like they pronouns, for example. There's this huge rapid social and language change that's happening right now. And so how do we, I don't think we can just set a rule. So there's this concept sometimes, we have to negotiate what we're going to do as a group. And that's affecting even just intros and how we're going to relate to each other, from step one.
Great. And do you know what? That's a great example. And so I think the answer to that is socialization. How do we socialize people over time with inclusive behaviors? So if you think about when you join a community, when you join any organization, your induction process, however that looks like, that's the socialization that they're trying to do. They're trying to tell you the values, what's acceptable, what isn't. This is the way things are done. So you may be part of a community, but over time it's changing. So we need to, over time, socialize people to think differently, because gender pronouns is a great example. Some people, when it's presented, because they haven't been socialized, it's alarming. Like, what do you mean? I don't understand. So we need to go through what I would say is gentle socialization over time. And this brings me back something that I like. We call it the same page strategy, right? And this is, if you notice at the beginning of this conversation, I basically said, this is what I mean by diversity. This is what I mean by inclusion. I got everybody onto the same page. Now, we don't have to disagree. It actually doesn't matter if we agree or disagree, but we've got a shared point of reference. And from that, we can start to have a meaningful conversation. You can understand what I mean. I can understand what you mean. So when I'm saying socialization, great example is to pick a term, a phrase, an article, podcast, anything. Have that as a point of reference. This works really great in a community where you're going to have regular contact over time, and you use that as your point of reference to speak with people. So if we're getting back to gender pronouns, if we had like an article or something about gender pronouns, hey, did you know this was a thing? And like, some people will say, no, it's not. Some on one side, it's like, no, this is necessary. This is how things need to be. On the other side, some people will be like, I never knew anything about it. We've got this shared point of reference. We can now start to have conversations about that. And that's really useful for those introductions and getting back into the groups that you said.
I love that. And I think it's become, it's one of those things that organizers and managers and people now who are in a position to be explicit about what is or isn't going to be in an introduction, or we have to now learn and say, like, okay, are we going to put our pronouns going to be part of intros? And like last night I was at a place, and by the way, I just want to say, I'm not even sure. I think there are cultural and religious reasons why, like, it's not even clear to me what the right outcome is here, especially in an international organization. But it's like the sort of the moderators or the managers, you know, have to make a decision and then be explicit, because otherwise something is going to happen, but it won't be intentional. I was at an event last night where this is very common. Of course, you know, we do intros at the beginning. And for me, what I've noticed, this is the first year where like everyone is giving pronouns. To me, this is like this remarkable thing is happening. So interesting. But then of course people forget, and, you know, how do we then reintroduce ourselves and, you know, handle changes over time? The organizer like stepped in and corrected people, which, you know, I don't even mind that much, but it actually meant a lot to me. It was really interesting. Yeah. Anyway, I'm always feeling like, am I making it difficult for people to connect with me because I'm different? So it's super interesting to see how this is getting negotiated. I'm sorry.
I hate to jump in.
Perfect. Do you know why? Can I jump in? Because this brings back what we said at the beginning about the psychological safety, right? So we know it may have been uncomfortable for some or others, but we're not going to ridicule anyone. We're not going to call people out. We're setting this standard. So what you've said there really ties together the socialization, the psychological safety, and also the intention. You said the organizer actually said, well, this is how it's going to be. So we're socializing, setting a standard, and everybody understands what's going on. So I think that was a great way of kind of wrapping up several things that we discussed earlier.
Yes, so I know we're pushing its time, but I do want to get this one question. So they asked, can you talk a little bit about the business case, as if we're going to get through this really quickly, but can you talk a little bit about the business case for increased diversity inclusion for improving results, especially in an international context? And by this, I mean the differences of X number of people in diverse US-based teams versus the same number of people spread across different parts of the world, like one in each country of like US, India, Japan, Latin America, etc. Which team distribution will yield better results and why?
Great question. I've got a very unpopular answer to this. You hear a lot of people making these claims. Diversity leads to greater innovation, greater creativity and stuff. If you actually look at the body of research, the business case for diversity is inconclusive. That upsets a lot of people when they say that, but the people who make these claims haven't read enough of the research. So what I do want to tell you is it's not, you have to find, if you remember the three biggest problems, performance, they're unable to articulate their own business case for diversity. So what I want to leave you with is there are three useful business cases for diversity, and you should explore them for yourself. So number one is this idea of discrimination and fairness. You know, the whole social justice argument that it's the right thing to do. And you'll hear people use that phrase. It's good for business, but it's the right thing to do. So that's one thing, discrimination, fairness. The second one is access and legitimacy. So if we think of the biggest tech company that you can imagine, right, who's serving a global audience, they want access to that global audience. So if we were going to launch in China, would it be useful that we understood Chinese business practices? Maybe we've got people who are Chinese who can actually communicate in a way that I can't because I'm not Chinese. Yes, that would be useful. That gives us access. Then there's also legitimacy. If we are serving the world, then perhaps we should represent the world. And if we don't, that kind of undermines our legitimacy. This is why about 10 years ago, all the big tech companies, they raced to put out all of their diversity and inclusion data, even though it was really bad, because it didn't matter. What mattered was they were claiming to be legitimate because they were global players. So those are two. So we've got discrimination and fairness, access and legitimacy, and then the third one is called integration and learning, right? This is the one where people say, well, because we think differently, we're able to collaborate, we are going to get better results. So there's three business cases. And so this is what I would challenge and invite you to do. Whenever anyone either likes diversity, dislikes diversity, they always speak in one of these three ways. You'll be amazed. If you push them and say, why don't you like it? Why aren't you interested? Why is it a waste of time? They will always point to one of these things. And so I would engage with them on that and try to further understand it. But that's my toolkit for how you can explore it yourself. But the unfortunate answer is there is no tried and tested consistent answer for a business case for diversity being consistently the best way to run a team. There just isn't one. And that's the unpopular truth. And you don't hear many people say it.